Judge Simone Davis, a black woman in a powerful judicial position, faces systemic racism and prejudice as she presides over a high-stakes corporate case. Her authority is constantly undermined by subtle microaggressions and overt attacks, particularly from the defense attorney, Randall Hughes, who questions her impartiality due to her race. Despite her calm professionalism, Davis is targeted by corrupt forces within the system, including a conspiracy to manipulate the trial. As Hughes and others try to exploit her position, Davis is forced to confront the deeply ingrained biases that seek to strip her of her hard-earned power. The courtroom was quiet, as all good courtrooms should be before the storm. The scent of polished wood mingled with the sharp, sterile air of legal papers and the weight of decisions yet to be made. It was the kind of place that demanded respect, the kind of place where people like Judge Simone Davis had learned to command both reverence and caution. She had walked these halls for years, her rise from the rough streets of Brooklyn to a position of immense power hard-earned, and not without sacrifice. She wasn't like most of the others in the courtroom today. She was, in fact, one of the few who could truly claim to have worked their way from nothing. She wasn't born with a silver spoon or groomed for success by some old money dynasty. No, Judge Davis had built herself from the ground up. She was a black woman, a child of the system that had often overlooked her, and she had spent her life dismantling the barriers that had been built to keep people like her out. But none of that was apparent today, not unless you looked closely. There were no grand gestures, no obvious signs of her wealth or her power. The walls of the courthouse were steeped in tradition, and Judge Davis had a quiet reverence for that. She respected the long history of law, but she also knew how easy it was for the system to serve those who didn't need it to be kind or just. So she made sure to keep her own actions measured, humble even. Today, however, was different. Today, as she sat in her chambers reviewing a case, she couldn't help but feel the familiar twinge of a challenge ahead. The case on the docket was a corporate merger, one that could make or break the future of a billion-dollar company. But as always, it wasn't just about the money, not for her. Judge Davis had long ago become accustomed to the irony that her greatest victories in life had often been met with the least celebration. People had a tendency to look past her, to see only the title she wore, the black robe she donned, the authority she commanded. It wasn't often that they noticed how she dressed simply. Today, in a tailored black dress that barely skimmed her knees, her gold necklace a quiet hint at her success, but nothing ostentatious. Her shoes were practical, a comfortable pair of black heels, though a whisper of her real wealth, private jets, exotic trips, luxury homes, was carefully hidden beneath a low-key exterior. The world outside the courthouse, however, didn't always understand that. To most people, she was just another powerful woman, a successful black woman, one whose life was somehow both visible and invisible at the same time. It was a contradiction she had learned to live with. The courthouse lobby bustled with activity, but there was an underlying sense of unease. Most of the staff here had worked with her long enough to know that Judge Davis didn't play by the same rules as some of her colleagues. She didn't walk into the room with the arrogance of someone who expected everyone to immediately know her name. No, she waited, observed, listened before making her presence known. And while many of the attorneys who passed by her desk shot her the occasional sideways glance, it was rare that anyone took a moment to acknowledge her in any meaningful way. It wasn't intentional, but it was something she noticed all the same. Judge Davis had long ago realized the subtle differences between how people treated her when they thought she was simply a black woman in power, and how they treated her when they recognized her for what she truly was. A force to be reckoned with. One who had a history of breaking barriers, winning battles, and using her influence to push for systemic change. But it was these quiet moments, these subtle dismissals, that always stuck with her the most. It was these moments that made the victories feel less certain, that always reminded her that, even at the top, she still had to fight. Her thoughts were interrupted as her assistant, Eric, stepped into the room. He was carrying a folder, his face a little too tight with concern. Judge Davis knew that look. She had seen it on more than a few faces in her years on the bench, the look of someone trying to pass off bad news without coming right out and saying it. "Judge," Eric began, his voice cautious but steady, "the case you've been assigned, the merger, It's been scheduled for a press briefing after the hearing this afternoon. A lot of the local media outlets are going to be there. Judge Davis raised an eyebrow. Media? For a corporate merger? Yeah, Eric replied, flipping open the folder. It's a big one. The company's being investigated for insider trading, and there's been some pushback on the ethics of the merger. It's going to be controversial. A lot of people are watching this one. She leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of his words settle in. She knew all too well the scrutiny that came with cases like these, the way the press could twist a single misstep, the way they could use someone's power, someone's skin color, as a tool to create doubt and suspicion. But Jada Davis had been here before. She had weathered storms much worse than this. I see, she said calmly, her voice a low, measured tone that demanded attention. Prepare the briefing. I'll need a few minutes before I make my opening statement. As Eric nodded and turned to leave, Jada could feel the slight tug in her chest, a reminder of just how much she had overcome to get here, and how much she still had to face. She would never forget that there were those who underestimated her because of her appearance, her race, or her gender. But she had learned over the years that she didn't need to prove herself to anyone. She simply had to show up and do the work. The courtroom doors swung open, and the sound of heels clicking on the marble floors filled the room as she stepped out. It was time to begin. Jada entered the main courtroom, the silence almost oppressive as the lawyers on both sides adjusted their notes. She wasn't in the room yet, but they were already aware of her presence. She could feel their eyes, their assessments of her, even before they fully acknowledged her. At the defense table, a well-dressed lawyer with a smug expression glanced over at her and gave a slight, barely perceptible nod. Jada knew the game. He was already trying to size her up, to determine if she would be an easy opponent or if she was just another high-powered woman who had crawled her way to the top. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was how much she had fought to get here. To them, she was just another judge in another courthouse, another person in a system that had been built to favor others. But she wasn't just that. She was the person who was going to make sure that this case didn't end the way they thought it would. The plaintiff's attorney, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, stood up when she entered. He wasn't familiar with her, but his courtesy was genuine, an acknowledgement of her authority, not her race. He met her eyes, not with caution, but with the barest flicker of respect. The gallery filled with murmurs, and for a moment, Jada paused. Her fingers rested lightly on the top of her gavel, its weight reassuring in her palm. She looked around the room, her gaze passing over the faces in the crowd. Some of them were here because they had business with the court. Some of them were here to see the spectacle. Others, like the corporate representatives from the company involved, were here because they had to be. But as Jada's gaze settled on the plaintiff, she saw something different. A look of exhaustion in his eyes, a quiet pleading for justice that she had seen countless times in her career. This wasn't just about a merger. This was about more than money or power. This was about the system, about breaking it open, exposing the cracks that always seemed to swallow up people like him, people like her, people who couldn't afford to fail. She cleared her throat, standing tall, her presence unmistakable. Her voice, when it came, was calm, authoritative, but not harsh. "Let's begin," she said, the simple words reverberating through the room. As she glanced at the defendant's side of the room, she knew this was only the beginning. The fight ahead would not be an easy one, but as always, she was ready. And this time, she wouldn't be overlooked. The trial proceeded with an eerie calm, the kind of calm that settled in after the first few exchanges, when both sides had started to settle into their roles, and the court became a battleground of words and strategies. The first few hours were methodical, with both parties outlining their arguments in perfect legalese, their voices weaving in and out of the room like a well-rehearsed symphony. But it was clear to Judge Simone Davis, who had been carefully observing every word, that there was something more at play here than just a corporate merger or a fight over numbers. As the day wore on, Judge Davis could feel it. A tension simmering just below the surface, not from the lawyers, but from the room itself, from the murmurs and sideways glances, from the unspoken assumptions that were building like a wall around her. It wasn't just that she was a judge in a case this high profile. It was that she was a black woman in a courtroom filled with people who hadn't yet learned to see her for who she truly was. Across the courtroom, the defense counsel, a slick, well-dressed man named Randall Hughes, made a deliberate move to underscore the legitimacy of his client's position. Hughes, tall and sharp-featured, with a smile that never seemed to reach his eyes, spoke with the kind of polished authority that most corporate lawyers wear like a second skin. He turned his focus to Judge Davis in the midst of his closing argument. "Your Honor, we trust that you will give this matter the full consideration it deserves," Hughes said, his tone smooth as silk, though it barely masked the underlying condescension. "We're simply asking that the court allow the merger to proceed without further delay. It's a process that has been thoroughly vetted, and we've complied with all the legal requirements." There was something in the way he said, "we trust," that sent a ripple of unease through Judge Davis. It was as if he was reminding her of her position, implying that her judgment could be swayed with the right amount of persuasion. She had heard it all before, the subtle, underhanded ways people sought to reduce her authority to nothing more than a checkbox to tick off in the process. A black woman in this seat wasn't supposed to be here, let alone make waves in a case like this. Judge Davis didn't let her discomfort show. She gave him a calm nod and a pointed look. "I assure you, Mr. Hughes, that I will give this case my full attention. I expect the same from all parties involved." The words were measured, but beneath them, a quiet steel edge could be heard. She wasn't the kind of judge who needed to remind anyone of her authority. She had earned that respect, though some still chose to ignore it. For a moment, Hughes paused, then quickly turned back to his case, the faintest flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. He had likely expected to get under her skin, to assert dominance in the room with his privilege, but Judge Davis remained unmoved, as calm and composed as ever. The tension between them was palpable, but it wasn't just the defense lawyer who was making assumptions about Judge Davis. There was a quiet undercurrent running through the room, one that was subtly amplified by the presence of the media, who had gathered to document every step of this trial. They weren't here because they cared about justice, they were here because they cared about the spectacle. A black woman in charge of a major case involving powerful corporations was something they could exploit, something they could turn into a headline. As the afternoon wore on, the questions from the media began to feel more like a test, a challenge. Not for the defendant or the plaintiff's counsel, but for Judge Davis herself. A reporter leaned in during a brief recess, asking, "Judge Davis, do you think your personal background will influence your decision today? You know, you come from let's say, a different kind of background than many of the other judges in this building." The words were casual, but the tone dripped with the kind of implicit bias that only someone who didn't think twice about their privilege could articulate. It was as if she were supposed to answer for her existence, to prove her worth beyond the credentials that she had built her life on. Judge Davis didn't flinch. She turned to the reporter, her expression steady. "My background, as you so delicately put it, has nothing to do with the facts of the case," she replied, "and I expect that all of you will judge the case on the merits of the law, not on the race or background of those involved." The reporter smiled, though there was a subtle edge to it, as if he had expected something more dramatic. He scribbled down the words, likely eager to turn them into something more salacious. Judge Davis could feel the weight of the gaze that followed her every move now, the way her every word seemed to carry more weight than the arguments themselves. It wasn't enough for her to be a judge, she had to be perfect, anything less, and she risked feeding the stereotype of the angry black woman, or worse, the unqualified black woman. As the case moved forward, it became more and more clear that this was not just a legal battle, it was a fight for her right to exist in this space without apology. By late afternoon, the tension had reached a fever pitch. The defense lawyer's closing remarks had become increasingly pointed, and Judge Davis could feel his contempt growing with every word. He was trying to undermine her authority without saying it outright, using the language of the courtroom to deflect and distort. It wasn't just about the case anymore, it was about a fundamental disrespect for her position. "Your Honor, I do believe that we've presented more than enough evidence to prove the case for the merger," Hughes said, his voice smooth but laced with an unmistakable layer of condescension. "And I trust you will rule in favor of the clients. It's not just the logical decision, it's the right decision." She didn't need to hear him out any longer. She had heard the undercurrent before, had heard it in the way people spoke to her, as if she needed to be guided through the decisions she was paid to make. He didn't think she had the authority to challenge him, or to dismiss his claims. He didn't think a woman like her should be sitting in the judge's seat at all. Her hands rested lightly on the gavel in front of her. The room was silent, the air thick with expectation. "I will make my decision when I am ready, Mr. Hughes," she said, her voice as cold and calm as ever. "And it will be based solely on the law, not on your assumptions or what you consider to be logical." For a moment, the room was still. She could see Hughes's jaw tighten, could feel the collective discomfort of the room. They all knew what was coming next. This wasn't about the case anymore. This was about power, her power, and their discomfort with it. As the court recessed for the evening, Judge Davis could feel the weight of the day's events pressing on her. Every glance, every comment, had been an attempt to chip away at her authority, to remind her that she didn't belong, but she wasn't going to let that happen. Not today, not ever. Later that evening, as she stood in the courtroom alone, preparing to head home, her phone buzzed with an alert. It was an email from her law clerk, who had been keeping track of the media coverage. "Judge, it seems that the press has been running a story all afternoon about your unusual ruling style," the email read. "They're questioning your impartiality and suggesting that your personal life might cloud your judgment." Judge Davis exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the phone. The media was doing what it always did, turning her existence into a spectacle, all while pretending to care about the law. It was a constant game of manipulation. But it wasn't the press that frustrated her most. It was the quiet whispers from the people who believed she didn't belong here. The people who thought that her intelligence, her grace, her education, and her career were simply the exception that proved the rule. She closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the world pressing against her chest. She had made it this far. And now, this, the constant reminder that no matter what she achieved, there would always be those who saw her only for what she looked like. But she didn't have the luxury of losing her temper, losing control. She knew that. And so, with a steady breath, Judge Davis silenced the phone, slipped it back into her pocket, and walked out of the courtroom, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. The fight was just beginning. The courtroom had become a pressure cooker, each passing minute adding to the mounting intensity that everyone in the room felt, but few would acknowledge Judge Simone Davis sat on the bench, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she surveyed the room. There was a subtle shift in the air, a change in the energy that wasn't caused by the arguments being made, but by something deeper, something personal. The defense attorney, Randall Hughes, had made it clear from the start that he intended to make this trial not just about the case, but about his perception of her competence. His criticisms had been thinly veiled beneath the language of legal jargon, but they were impossible to ignore. He wasn't just questioning her judgment, he was questioning her place in the room. It was the kind of undercurrent she had become used to, but this time, it felt different, more deliberate, more calculated. As Hughes wrapped up his statement, he flashed a practiced smile and turned to the jury, addressing them with a casual, almost patronizing tone. "We trust, as always, that this court will act in the best interests of justice, free from bias or outside influence. A fair ruling is all we ask, Your Honor." The words were innocuous on the surface, but to Judge Davis, they felt like a direct challenge. It wasn't just about the facts anymore. It was about her authority, her very presence. She had already shown him once that she wouldn't be swayed by his subtle insults, but now, in front of the jury, he was pushing harder. Testing her. The room was thick with anticipation, and Judge Davis could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her. The jury, the media, the onlookers. They all expected her to rise to the occasion, to give them the drama they craved. But all she could think about was the quiet war being waged against her, a battle she could never fully escape. She took a deep breath and stood, the gavel resting in her palm like a reminder of her role in this moment. "Mr. Hughes," she said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. "This court will continue as it has. With fairness and impartiality, I will make my decision based on the law, not personal opinion." Her words hung in the air, but the defense lawyer didn't back down. Instead, his smile widened, just a little too much. "I'm sure you will, Your Honor," he replied, his tone laced with an edge of mockery. "We'll leave it in your capable hands." The tension in the room spiked, and for a moment, Judge Davis thought she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in the silence. This wasn't just about winning the case. It was about proving that she belonged here, that her power and authority were not to be questioned. But as much as she wanted to respond with something sharper, something that would silence him for good, she knew the stakes were too high. The world was watching, but the battle wasn't over. It was only beginning. As the courtroom recessed for the evening, Judge Davis retreated to her chambers, her mind racing with the questions she couldn't let go. There was something off about the way the defense had presented their case, something beneath the surface that hinted at a larger game at play, a game where her authority was just another pawn to be moved. She sat at her desk, her fingers pressing against her temples, trying to shake off the weight of the day. The pressure was starting to get to her. She had been in this position before, had faced these subtle undermining tactics from the moment she took the bench, but never had it felt this dangerous. There was an insidious quality to it now, like a clock was ticking, counting down to something she couldn't quite predict. Suddenly, the door to her office opened, and in walked her law clerk, Mitchell, a young, earnest man who had been working with her for the past few months. His face was pale, his eyes wide with concern. "Judge," Mitchell said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this." She stood up, a mix of curiosity and dread settling in her stomach as she followed him to his desk. He clicked open his laptop, revealing a live newsfeed. The headline flashed across the screen: "Judge Simone Davis under fire for alleged bias in landmark merger case." The words hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't just an opinion piece or a minor critique. This was the kind of attack that could destroy everything she had worked for. The article was filled with insinuations, questioning her impartiality based on her race, her background, and even the way she carried herself in court. It was exactly the kind of smear campaign she had feared. The kind that didn't just challenge her ruling, but questioned her very right to sit at the bench. Who is behind this?" Judge Davis asked, her voice cold with disbelief. Mitchell looked grim. "We don't know yet, but it's already getting picked up by the local networks. They're turning this into something much bigger than it is." Judge Davis's mind raced. The media had always been an unpredictable beast, quick to latch onto anything that could sell, quick to tear down anyone who didn't fit their narrative. And here she was, the subject of their latest frenzy. But that wasn't what worried her the most. What worried her was how many people in the system would now be looking at her differently. The media had already painted her as a problem. Now, those who had quietly dismissed her before would feel justified. The same people who thought she was an outsider, that her accomplishments didn't mean as much as the men in the room, the people with the right backgrounds. Now they would have more ammunition. They would see this story and think, maybe they were right about her. She inhaled sharply, pushing the thoughts aside. This wasn't the time for doubt. This wasn't the time for hesitation. It was time for action. "Get me a meeting with the chief," she said to Mitchell, her voice steel. Mitchell hesitated, but nodded, understanding the gravity of what was at stake. "I'll call him right away," he said, his hands already reaching for his phone. Judge Davis walked to the window and stared out over the city, the skyline bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. She could feel the weight of every decision she had made, the weight of every glance and every comment that had built up to this moment. It wasn't just her career on the line. It was the integrity of the entire judicial system, the very foundation of what she had sworn to protect. But if there was one thing she had learned over the years, it was that nothing worth fighting for came easy. The road had never been paved for her. She had fought for everything she had, clawed her way through every door that had been slammed in her face. And now, she wasn't about to let a few attacks from the media or a defense lawyer like Hughes intimidate her. No, she wasn't going down without a fight. She took a deep breath, the calm before the storm settling over her once more. The hours that followed were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and strategies as Judge Davis prepared for the next phase of the case. She knew the media storm was just the beginning. The real challenge would come when the powers that be in the judicial system made their move, and they would make their move. It was only a matter of time before her reputation was called into question at the highest levels. As she sat in her office, the knock on the door came. It was Mitchell again, but this time, he wasn't alone. The chief had agreed to meet with her. Chief Justice Armstrong was an older man, weathered by years of political maneuvering and the weight of his own power. He had seen it all, and his reputation was built on playing the game with finesse. He was one of the few in the system who had managed to maintain a balance of respect and ruthlessness. Someone who knew how to navigate the world of media and politics with the kind of ease that only experience could provide. But in that moment, his eyes held a flicker of concern that wasn't there before. "Judge Davis," he began, his voice quiet, "we've all seen the headlines, and I want to assure you that the council is taking this very seriously." Judge Davis nodded, her face hardening. "This is about more than the press, Chief. This is about ensuring that no one can undermine my authority on the bench. I've earned my position, and I will not have it questioned based on assumptions about who I am or where I come from." "I understand," Armstrong said, his tone calm but cautious. "But you know how this works. There are powerful forces at play here, forces that might not be happy with your approach to this case." "Powerful forces?" Judge Davis repeated, her voice low with a dangerous edge. "I've been fighting powerful forces my entire life. If they want to take me down, they can try, but I won't be intimidated." The chief's expression softened slightly, but there was a wariness in his eyes. "I'm not suggesting that you're intimidated. What I'm saying is, you need to be careful. The road ahead won't be easy." Judge Davis stood tall, her resolve hardening. "I'm prepared," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I'll take the consequences of my actions, but I'm not backing down." The conversation ended with a mixture of support and unease. Armstrong understood her resolve, but even he knew the path she was walking could lead to an inevitable showdown with the powers that controlled the system. As the door clicked shut behind him, Judge Davis turned to Mitchell, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "We've only just begun," she said, her voice sharp. "Get me everything on Hughes and the merger. There's more to this than meets the eye." The final pieces were falling into place. Judge Simone Davis was ready to face whatever came next. The climax was coming, and she was prepared to make her stand. The day after the media storm erupted, the atmosphere in the courthouse had shifted dramatically. Judge Simone Davis felt the weight of every step she took as she entered the courtroom. She was no longer just the presiding judge. She was a target. The press was camped outside, waiting for any crack in her resolve. Her every word and every action would be scrutinized, dissected, and possibly used against her. She could feel the weight of the cameras watching her as she walked past the reporters, their questions coming fast and furious. "Judge Davis, do you believe you can remain impartial after the media backlash?" one reporter shouted. "Are you biased against corporate interests, Judge Davis?" another asked, her voice tinged with accusation. Judge Davis didn't answer. She couldn't afford to. She had learned long ago that no matter how well you spoke, there were those who wouldn't listen. What they wanted wasn't the truth. They wanted a story, a spectacle. And right now, she was it. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The air was thick with the quiet hum of anxiety as people took their seats. The defense counsel, Randall Hughes, was already preparing to make his move. The case had already spiraled out of control, and now it was more than just about the merger. It was a power struggle. "Your Honor," Hughes began, addressing the court with a smile that barely concealed his disdain. "It seems the court has attracted quite a bit of attention, but I trust that you will continue to apply the law impartially." The comment was thinly veiled, an attempt to paint her as someone who couldn't handle the pressure the media had picked up on her every move, creating the perfect storm of doubt. Hughes was capitalizing on it, playing on the uncertainty in the air. His words weren't just an accusation, they were a challenge to her authority, to her right to be there. Judge Davis took a moment to steady herself. She could feel the fire in her chest, the simmering frustration that threatened to spill over, but she kept it under control. It wasn't anger she needed right now, it was strategy. "Mr. Hughes," she said, her voice even, controlled, "I will rule based on the facts and the law, not media attention or speculation. The case will proceed as scheduled." But Hughes wasn't finished. He could see that her composure was beginning to crack, just a little. He pressed on, his tone sharper now. "I'm sure you will, Your Honor, but when the reputation of a judge is in question, can any ruling truly be impartial? Surely, Your Honor, you must understand the risks at play here. This isn't just about legal procedure anymore, this is about public trust." It was a low blow, and everyone in the room could feel it. The jury shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between the two of them. Judge Davis could feel their gazes like a weight on her back. She stood taller, steeling herself for the coming storm. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction, she wasn't going to let him turn this into an attack on her credibility. "You will find, Mr. Hughes, that my reputation is built on integrity," she said, her voice colder now. "This case is about justice, and nothing more." But Hughes was relentless. He wasn't done trying to shake her. His eyes flicked over to the gallery, where a few sympathetic faces sat. Among them, she saw her colleague, Mitchell, a young law clerk who had been working alongside her for months. He was nervous, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He was loyal, yes, but this was bigger than any case they'd worked on. His eyes betrayed his concern, and for a moment, Judge Davis could see the tension in his face. Mitchell had always respected her, but even he had to see the writing on the wall. Hughes was playing the game with far more finesse than anyone had anticipated. And even though he hadn't said it, she knew Mitchell was wondering how much longer they could hold out against the storm. Protagonists resolve. The case had gone on for hours, each exchange between the opposing parties more charged than the last. Hughes was clearly trying to unbalance her, but Judge Davis had faced worse. She wasn't about to let some well-dressed corporate lawyer dictate the terms of this trial. She had risen above the mud of the system, clawed her way to the top, and she wasn't going to let it be torn down by these attacks. But as the day drew to a close, the stakes became clearer. The attack wasn't just coming from Hughes. It was coming from everyone. The media, the people who had been skeptical of her all along, the whispers behind closed doors in the higher echelons of the judicial system. They were all watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. As the session ended for the day, Judge Davis retreated to her chambers. Her hands were trembling slightly as she took off her robe, but her mind was sharp. She wasn't going to back down. She couldn't afford to. "Mitchell," she called, her voice steady, but filled with an intensity he hadn't seen before. "Get me everything we have on Hughes. I want to know who's behind this, who's pulling his strings." Mitchell nodded, though his face was clouded with hesitation. He was a good law clerk, sharp and diligent, but this was a level of manipulation he hadn't encountered before. He had seen Judge Davis face off against corrupt systems, but never quite like this. The stakes were so much higher now, and the pressure was almost unbearable. "I'll get on it right away," Mitchell said, though his voice faltered slightly. He left the room quickly, leaving Judge Davis alone with her thoughts. She paced for a few moments, the reality of her situation settling over her. This wasn't just about winning or losing a case. It was about proving a point. It was about showing the world that no matter what they thought of her, she belonged here, that she had earned this seat at the table. The weight of that truth pressed down on her. If she didn't fight back, if she didn't make a stand now, everything she had worked for would be erased. But there was something else, something simmering beneath her resolve. She knew that there were deeper forces at play here, forces that wanted to control the outcome of this trial. The merger wasn't just about business. It was about power, influence, and maintaining control. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became that Hughes wasn't acting on his own. There were others behind him, pulling the strings. People with enough power to make her life a living hell if she continued to defy them. But that was the thing. She had never played by the rules they had set. She had never been afraid to challenge the system. And she wasn't going to stop now. The following morning, the tension had reached its breaking point. Judge Davis was about to make her ruling on the case, but she knew it wasn't just about the decision she would make, it was about the fallout that would follow. Mitchell had returned to her office, his face pale, carrying the documents she had requested. He handed them to her without a word, his eyes not meeting hers. As she sifted through the papers, it became clear Hughes wasn't acting alone. There were powerful figures behind him. Corporate executives with ties to local government, members of the board who had used their influence to manipulate the system in their favor. "How long has this been going on?" she muttered to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. He was just as aware of the dangers as she was. "I don't know," Mitchell replied, his voice tight. "But there's something more. We found evidence that suggests that this isn't just about the merger. There's corruption at play. People at the top are working behind the scenes to influence the case." Judge Davis closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the information settling heavily on her. This was bigger than she had realized. This was no longer about just her credibility or the case. It was about the integrity of the entire system. The decision was clear, but so were the consequences. She had to expose the corruption. She had to make them pay for what they had done. But it wouldn't be easy. There were too many powerful figures invested in keeping the status quo. Too many risks involved. Mitchell watched her, clearly torn. "Judge, are you sure about this? I mean, going public with all this could destroy everything. They could come after us." Judge Davis turned to face him, her expression unwavering. "I'm not going to let them win. I'm not going to let them turn me into a puppet." She stood up, her eyes filled with resolve. "We need to take this to the people. We need to show the world what's really going on. It's the only way we'll have a chance." The stage was set. Judge Davis had made her decision. There was no turning back now. The courtroom was silent. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the weight of the moment hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Judge Simone Davis stood tall at the bench, her eyes fixed on the defense attorney, Randall Hughes, whose smug expression had not wavered since he had first set foot in the room. But now, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. The media buzz outside had grown louder, feeding on the controversy of the past few days, and the pressure was suffocating. Judge Davis knew she was being watched, not just by the journalists who had turned her into a spectacle, but by the system itself, the very system that had allowed people like Hughes to thrive at the expense of those they deemed unworthy. For the past several days, Hughes had been relentless. His words were carefully calculated, his attacks on her authority subtle but sharp. But it was more than just a case now. It was about power, control, and whether or not she would back down. Hughes had done everything in his power to unseat her from her position of authority, to undermine her every move, to make her question her place in a system that was built to exclude people like her. Judge Davis took a deep breath, her fingers lightly gripping the gavel. She wasn't going to let him win. Not today. Hughes was standing across from her, his posture perfect, his voice dripping with calculated politeness. "Your Honor," he began, "the court cannot ignore the overwhelming evidence presented by my client's team. The facts are clear. The merger is in the best interests of the economy, the employees, and the shareholders. Yet, here we are, delayed by what I can only assume is personal bias, given the circumstances surrounding this trial." There it was, the subtle jab, the insinuation that her ruling was clouded by personal feelings. The words weren't directly accusing her of bias, but they were designed to plant a seed of doubt in the jury's mind. Hughes knew exactly what he was doing. Judge Davis's eyes narrowed as she studied him, the familiar anger rising within her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She couldn't let him provoke her. "Mr. Hughes," she said, her voice steady but cutting, "the law is impartial. I am impartial. This case is about justice, not the interests of powerful corporations. If you believe your client's merger is without fault, I expect you to present the facts, not attempts to undermine the integrity of this court." Hughes stiffened at her words, his confident demeanor faltering for a split second before he quickly regained control. "Of course, Your Honor," he replied, his tone too sweet to be sincere. "I only meant that, under the circumstances, it seems clear that we will not get the fair hearing we deserve, but that's beside the point. The real question here is whether or not we can trust your judgment moving forward. Can you be impartial, given the public outcry against this case?" A murmur rippled through the room at his words, and Judge Davis felt the eyes of the jury on her. This was the moment he had been leading up to, the moment where he would try to paint her as unfit to preside over this case, a black woman standing in the way of corporate power. She felt a flash of rage, but she kept it buried beneath layers of professionalism. She had earned this position, she had fought for it, and she would not let him or anyone else strip that away from her. "I have made no secret of my commitment to the law, Mr. Hughes," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "You can question my motives all you want, but I will not allow anyone to question my ability to rule fairly." Hughes's eyes flashed, the mask slipping for a moment. It was clear that he had been hoping for her to crack, for her to lose her composure in front of the jury, but instead, he found himself confronted by the full force of her resolve. "You think you can intimidate me, don't you?" Hughes spat, the facade of politeness completely gone now. You think that by holding your ground, you'll somehow change the fact that the people out there," he gestured toward the gallery where reporters were snapping photos, "are already calling for your resignation. You're a joke, Judge Davis, a black woman in a position like this. The only reason you've made it this far is because you've played the game, and now that you're in over your head, you're just trying to save face." The words were like a slap to her face. They weren't just about the case. They were about everything she had worked for. It was an attempt to strip her of her dignity, her worth, and reduce her to nothing more than the color of her skin. But Judge Davis didn't flinch. She stood up straighter, her gaze locking with Hughes's, her voice cold and controlled. "Mr. Hughes," she said, each word deliberate, "the only thing I've played is the law, and if you think for 1 second that I will allow you or anyone else to undermine the integrity of this court, you are gravely mistaken." The room was dead silent. No one moved, no one breathed. It was as if the entire world had stopped, and for a moment, there was only the sound of her voice, cutting through the tension like a knife. Hughes sneered, but the anger in his eyes was matched by a flicker of fear. For the first time in this trial, he knew he had underestimated her, and for a moment, it was clear that he had no idea how to respond, but he didn't back down. Instead, he shot one last venomous look at Judge Davis before turning to address the jury. "You may think you have a fair judge here," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But this trial is already a farce. We'll see how it plays out." The words were an attempt to poison the jury's perception of her, to turn the tide in his favor. But Judge Davis knew what she had to do. She wasn't just going to let him walk all over her. She was going to take control of this moment, expose him for the fraud he was, and remind the court that this was her case to decide. "Mr. Hughes, you will not intimidate me," Judge Davis said, her tone calm but firm. "And you will not dictate the terms of this trial. The law will prevail here today, and you will have your day in court, just like everyone else. But if you continue to make personal attacks on my character, I will hold you in contempt of court." The tension in the room was almost unbearable, but it was clear that Judge Davis had regained control. She had taken the fight to Hughes, and for the first time in this trial, it was obvious that the defense was on the defensive. Hughes stood there, glaring at her, the weight of his failed attempt to undermine her hanging in the air like a shadow. His bravado had shattered, replaced by the realization that he had misjudged her. But it wasn't just Hughes who had something to hide. There were darker forces at play. As Judge Davis turned to the court to continue, she felt something shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just about Hughes anymore, it was bigger than that. Something was about to come to light. Her law clerk, Mitchell, who had been digging into the case and the corporate ties of the defendants, stepped forward, holding a thick envelope in his hands. He looked pale, almost shaken, but his eyes were wide with determination. "Judge Davis," Mitchell said quietly, "I've got something you need to see this." The room fell silent as Mitchell opened the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. He passed a document to Judge Davis, who unfolded it slowly. Her eyes scanned the page, her heart hammering as she read the incriminating evidence. It was a series of emails, exchanges between corporate executives and government officials, all discussing ways to manipulate the case, to sway her decision, to ensure that the merger went through, no matter the cost. There it was, the corruption exposed in black and white. The very people who had been pulling the strings behind Hughes had been working in the shadows, using their power and influence to subvert the law. Judge Davis's hands shook, but only for a moment. She looked up at Mitchell, her eyes blazing with resolve. "Get this to the jury," she said, her voice low but filled with quiet fury. "Now!" She turned back to the courtroom, where Hughes was watching her closely. For the first time, his expression faltered as he realized that the tables had turned. "You were right about one thing, Mr. Hughes," Judge Davis said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This trial is about more than just the merger. It's about corruption, manipulation, and the people who think they can control this system. But it ends today. You can hide behind your corporate ties and your political games, but this is where it stops." The stakes had never been higher. The corruption had been exposed. The game was no longer in Hughes's hands. It was hers. But just as she was about to call for the jury's deliberation, the courtroom doors burst open, and a group of officers stormed in. Officer Daniels, the lead investigator on the case, stepped forward, his eyes locked on Judge Davis. The tension in the room ratcheted up instantly. "Judge Davis," Daniel said, his voice gruff. "You're under arrest for tampering with evidence. You've interfered with an ongoing investigation." The room went still as Judge Davis's heart stopped. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The storm had come for her, but she wasn't going to back down now. Judge Simone Davis sat at the bench, the gavel resting in her hand, her knuckles white from the pressure she was exerting to maintain control. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating, and the weight of the moment felt heavier than anything she had ever faced before. Her every move was being watched, not just by the jury, but by the media, the public, and the powerful interests that had stacked the deck against her. Hughes, the defense attorney, had spent the last hour attacking her with a subtle venom, questioning her impartiality, and trying to paint her as unfit to rule on this case. His words had been laced with insinuations, pushing her to the edge, but she had kept her composure, until now. Judge Davis could feel it. The breaking point. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This wasn't about the law. It was about power, control, and a deliberate attempt to undermine her authority in every way possible, and she wasn't going to let it stand. "Your Honor," Hughes began again, his voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We have all seen the headlines. It seems that your position as judge in this case is no longer just about legal expertise. The people out there," he motioned toward the gallery, where the reporters sat hungrily watching every exchange, "are questioning your ability to remain impartial. How can we trust that your ruling won't be influenced by the public outcry?" The words hung in the air, like a challenge, daring her to respond. He was pushing her now, testing her resolve. His gaze flicked over her, as if expecting her to back down, to show some sign of weakness. He couldn't have been more wrong. Judge Davis set the gavel down slowly, her fingers grazing the polished wood, the weight of the gesture symbolizing everything she had built in this moment. Her voice was calm, measured, and yet filled with an undeniable authority that rang through the silence in the room. "Mr. Hughes," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly, "I am well aware of the media attention surrounding this case, but I will remind you that this court is not governed by public opinion or press speculation. It is governed by the law, and if you wish to continue to play these games, I will not hesitate to hold you in contempt." There it was, the line she had drawn in the sand. The challenge was unmistakable, and for a moment, she could see the flicker of doubt cross Hughes's face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He wasn't finished yet. Hughes took a step forward, his voice rising with a controlled fury. "You think you can intimidate me with your position, don't you? A black woman in this seat of power, sitting in judgment of men who have built empires. You think your words can change what's already been decided?" He gestured widely to the courtroom, as though all the world was on his side. "The system was never built for people like you." The words hit her like a physical blow, but Judge Davis didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. The whispers, the doubts, the dismissals. This was what they had always believed about her. That she didn't belong. That no matter how hard she worked, no matter how many doors she kicked down, there would always be someone who saw her as less than. But this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. "Mr. Hughes," she said, her voice now colder, each word like ice. "You may think you know who I am, but you don't. You don't know the hours I've spent in this system, the sacrifices I've made to earn my place here. You don't know what it's like to have to fight for every inch, to prove yourself in a world that was never meant for people like me." Her eyes locked on his, unwavering. The room seemed to grow still. The air thickened, and she felt the gaze of everyone in the room on her. The audience, the jury, even the other lawyers. All of them were waiting for her to make her move. "I've spent my entire career breaking barriers," she continued, "and I will not let you or anyone else dismiss my authority because of who I am. The law doesn't bend to the will of powerful men, and neither will I." Hughes's face contorted with rage. He took a step back, his fist clenching at his side, his eyes filled with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "You think you're above reproach? You think you can hold the system together just by sheer will? The truth is, Judge Davis, this case doesn't matter. It's not about justice. It's about who holds the power, and right now, it's not you. Not anymore." The words were meant to break her, to rattle her. But Judge Davis stood her ground. She could feel her pulse quicken. But it wasn't fear. It was resolve. She had come too far to let him, or anyone, break her now. And then, as the room held its breath, the revelation came. The shift in the air was palpable, the sudden realization that this wasn't just about the case. There was something bigger at play here. Something darker. Mitchell, her law clerk, had been silent for most of the trial, but now he stepped forward, his face pale, holding a file in his hands. His voice trembled as he addressed the court. "Your Honor," Mitchell said, his voice shaking slightly, I have evidence. There's something you need to see." The tension in the room was immediate, the quiet murmurs turning to hushed whispers. Judge Davis's eyes flicked to Mitchell, a sense of dread creeping into her chest. She had been anticipating this moment. She had known, deep down, that there was more to this case than met the eye, but she hadn't expected it to come out like this. Not in the middle of the trial. Mitchell handed her the file, and as Judge Davis opened it, her eyes skimmed the documents with growing horror. There it was, proof of corporate manipulation, evidence of a deliberate attempt to undermine the judicial process. There were emails between Hughes and several executives, messages that discussed how they could influence the case to ensure the merger went through. There was a conversation with a government official suggesting that the case needed to be manipulated to preserve the status quo. And at the bottom of the chain of emails, a note that sent a chill down her spine. "The judge is the only obstacle now. We can't let her get in the way." Her hand shook as she looked at Mitchell. "How long has this been going on?" she whispered. Mitchell swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "We didn't know, Judge, but it's clear now they've been using Hughes as a pawn." Judge Davis's mind raced. This was more than just a case about a corporate merger. This was about corruption at the highest levels, about a system that had been manipulated from the inside out. It was about the people who had used their wealth and power to subvert the law, to control everything from behind the scenes. She stood tall, holding the evidence in her hands, her gaze never leaving Hughes. He had been exposed. The curtain had been pulled back. The game was up. "This isn't just about your client's merger, Mr. Hughes," she said, her voice steady, but filled with quiet fury. "This is about a conspiracy to manipulate this court, to control the very system that's meant to serve the people. Your client may think they're above the law, but I'll make sure they're held accountable. And as for you, Mr. Hughes?" She let the words hang in the air. "You've been playing a dangerous game, and it's over." Hughes's face twisted in shock and rage. "You can't prove any of this. It's fabricated. It's lies." But Judge Davis didn't flinch. She had the truth on her side now. "I'll make sure the jury sees the truth," she said, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade. "And I'll make sure that justice is done." The room was on edge, the tension rising to a fever pitch. Hughes had lost his composure, and now it was clear that the case had shifted entirely. Judge Davis had made her stand, but the fight wasn't over yet. The evidence was out, but the consequences were still to be seen. Could she turn this around? Could she expose the corruption and take down the powerful people behind it? The stakes had never been higher. The future of the case, her career, and perhaps even her very freedom hung in the balance. And just as she thought she had control of the situation, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Judge Davis, you are under arrest," came the cold, gruff voice from the back of the room. The word sent a jolt through her body. Officer Daniels, the man who had been eyeing her from the very beginning, stood at the door, his hand resting on his holstered gun. There was no mistaking his intention. The very forces she had fought so hard to expose were coming for her now, attempting to silence her. "On what charge?" Judge Davis asked, her voice steady but filled with shock. The room fell into a hush as Daniels took a step forward. "Tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice." The room was frozen, and Judge Davis stood there, her pulse pounding in her ears. They were trying to take her down, but they weren't going to succeed. Judge Davis took a deep breath, her mind racing. The moment of confrontation had arrived, and everything she had worked for was on the line. The pieces were in place, but the outcome remained uncertain. Would she be able to clear her name, or would the forces arrayed against her win the day? The gavel was still in her hand, Her future was about to be decided, and the weight of that decision was heavier than anything she had ever faced. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Simone Davis stood tall, the weight of the arrest order hanging over her like a guillotine. Officer Daniels was inches away from her, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for, the moment where everything would change. Hughes, still standing at the defense table, watched the scene unfold with a smirk that slowly began to fade as the tension in the room thickened. The audience, the jury, the reporters, they were all waiting, holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. But Judge Davis had already made up her mind. She wasn't going down without a fight. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering, "I am the presiding judge here. If you have a warrant for my arrest, show it to me. Otherwise, I suggest you step away from the bench." Daniels hesitated, his eyes narrowing, the weight of the situation finally starting to settle in. There was no warrant, there was no legal justification for the arrest. This was a play, one last move from the forces trying to silence her. She had seen it coming, and she wasn't about to let them take her down like this. At that moment, Mitchell, her law clerk, appeared at her side, his face flushed with urgency. "Judge, we've got it. We've got the evidence." The room erupted in a murmur as Mitchell rushed forward, holding up a thick stack of papers. He placed them on the bench before her, his hands trembling slightly. The documents were filled with the full scope of the conspiracy: emails, phone records, and even testimony from whistleblowers inside the corporation that had tried to manipulate the case from the very start. Judge Davis scanned the pages quickly, her mind racing as she pieced together the final fragments of the puzzle. Hughes's face turned a shade of red that matched the anger in his eyes. He stepped forward, his voice trembling with fury. "This is nonsense, you can't just—" Judge Davis held up a hand, silencing him. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Mr. Hughes, but this isn't over yet." She turned to Officer Daniels, her voice cold and commanding. "If you're here to uphold the law, then do your job and arrest the individuals who have been working to subvert it. But as of now, you're holding the wrong person." The tension in the room reached its peak. For a moment, everyone was frozen, waiting for Daniels to make his move, for Hughes to retaliate. But just as it seemed the situation might explode, the doors to the courtroom opened and several figures stepped in. Two uniformed police officers, followed by a government investigator, entered the room, their presence commanding immediate attention. The investigator, a woman in a dark suit, walked up to Daniels and whispered something in his ear. Daniels' expression faltered as he looked at the woman, then back at Judge Davis. He seemed to deflate, his posture sagging slightly as he stepped back. "Your Honor," the investigator said, addressing Judge Davis with respect, "we've just received confirmation. There's a larger network of individuals involved in this scheme, corporate executives, government officials. We've been tracking them for weeks." Judge Davis's eyes flashed with recognition. The investigation was finally happening. The pieces were coming together, and now, the truth would come out. "Are you saying you have evidence of this conspiracy?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. The investigator nodded, handing over a file. "We've already started arrests. Hughes's involvement has been confirmed. He's been feeding information to several corporate players, and there's even more we're uncovering. But we couldn't act without the right evidence. You've just given us what we needed." The courtroom erupted in shock, the full weight of the revelation sinking in. The public had been focused on Judge Davis's every move, but it was the actions of the powerful men behind the scenes that had really been the story all along. The media, which had hounded her for days, now turned its attention to Hughes and the corruption at the heart of the case. Hughes, his face pale with disbelief, sputtered in protest. "This isn't happening! You can't do this!" But it was already too late. The investigator turned to the officers. "Arrest Mr. Hughes and make sure to gather every piece of evidence you can." The officers stepped forward, handcuffing Hughes, who struggled and shouted, but was ultimately subdued. Judge Davis watched as the man who had tried to tear her down was escorted out of the room, his power evaporating with every step he took. As the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate, Judge Davis took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging slightly as she allowed herself a moment of relief. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. The fight wasn't over, and there was still work to be done. But for now, justice had prevailed. Judge Davis looked at the faces in the courtroom, the jury, the reporters, the law enforcement officials, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. It wasn't a smile of victory, but of quiet strength. She had faced the full force of a broken system, one that had tried to tear her down at every turn, but she had fought back, not with anger, but with resolve. She had used the law to expose the corruption, to stand tall in the face of those who tried to undermine her. As the courtroom cleared, Mitchell approached her, a look of awe on his face. "Judge, I can't believe it. You did it. You really did it." Judge Davis nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting the weight of the moment. "We did it, Mitchell, together." Her mind raced, replaying the events of the past few days, the way the system had tried to break her, the way the media had twisted her every action. But through it all, she had learned something invaluable. She had learned that her strength didn't come from the system. It came from her resolve, from the courage to stand tall, no matter how many people tried to push her down. The victory wasn't just hers. It was for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. It was for everyone who had fought against a system that was stacked against them, and in that moment, she knew that she couldn't stop now. There was still so much work to be done. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the case was swift and far-reaching. Hughes, along with several high-ranking executives and government officials, were arrested and charged with corruption. The public outcry was overwhelming, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't directed at Judge Davis. Instead, the focus was on the systemic corruption that had plagued the system for years. Judge Davis was lauded for her courage and determination, but she knew that this was just the beginning. The arrest of the corporate elite and the exposure of the manipulation behind the case had sparked something larger, a movement toward reform. There were calls for greater transparency in the judicial system, for more oversight of corporate influence, and for a more equitable distribution of power. But there was still much to be done. The system had been shaken, but it had not yet been fully reformed. Judge Davis knew that her fight was far from over. She would continue to use her position to challenge the injustices that still existed, to push for accountability, and to ensure that the law worked for everyone, not just the powerful. As Judge Davis walked out of the courthouse for the last time that week, the weight of everything she had been through settled over her. The fight had been long, and it had taken a toll on her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it had also taught her something she hadn't fully understood before. She was more than just a judge. She was a force for change, a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no matter how broken the system might seem, there was always room for someone to stand up and make a difference. But as she walked down the steps, surrounded by the sounds of the city, she knew that this wasn't the end. The work would continue, and she would be there, leading the charge. As she turned the corner and stepped into the waiting car, her phone buzzed. A message from an old colleague, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. It was an invitation to a meeting, an invitation to join a national task force on judicial reform. The message was clear. Her work had only just begun. She sat back in the car, her heart racing with anticipation. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where she could truly make a lasting impact. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready for it. As the car drove off into the city, Judge Simone Davis looked out at the skyline, knowing that her journey, her fight for justice, was far from over.